She had a suitcase. Not a bag, a suitcase, the kind to pack when you're not planning on coming back. That night, I looked at it and thought she was running away from something. It took me months to understand. She was running toward something, toward me, and she'd been waiting for a reason long enough to finally use it. It was a Thursday evening in late October. I was in the armchair near the window, book open, lamp throwing yellow light across the room. The house was quiet, mine, the way it always was by that hour. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, like someone who had already made up their mind before their hand touched the door. I opened it. Elena was standing on my porch in the rain, hair soaked through water, moving in slow lines down her face. She wasn't crying, she was just wet, and she was looking at me, directly at me, not at her shoes, not past my shoulder, with a steadiness that didn't belong on someone caught in a storm. The suitcase stood beside her, full-sized, silver handle extended, heavy and patient, the way deliberate things are patient. She said, "Can I stay here just one night?" I looked at the suitcase, then at her eyes. Something didn't add up, but I didn't have a name for it yet. I opened the door wider, stepped back. The rain followed her in, and the cold and the low rumble of suitcase wheels crossing my threshold. I thought she looked like someone who had nowhere left to go. She looked like that on purpose. I've lived alone in this house for 3 years. 2 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard backed by old oaks. I bought it the year after the divorce came through. Chose it specifically because I'd never been inside it before. No memories, no version of me had stood in its hallway or sat at its kitchen table. It had no history of me, and I had none of it. That felt like exactly what I needed at the time. I'm a civil engineer, 40 years old. I get up at 6, make coffee, drive 20 minutes to a job site or the office, come home around 6 in the evening. I cook something simple, the kind of meal that makes sense for one person. I eat, I read, I sleep. On weekends, I run or work on whatever the house needs, or do nothing at all. I've gotten used to it. My life had gotten very small. I didn't mind. Small things are easier to trust. I want to be honest about what my marriage to Vivian actually was, because the easy version is simpler than the true one. We were married for 6 years. No children, neither of us ever felt settled enough about it, and by the time we were settled about anything, what we were settled about was that we were done. Vivian isn't a bad person. I want to say that plainly, because what comes later might make her sound like one. She's a person who needed things I couldn't give her, or more precisely, things that weren't compatible with who I am. She needed noise and motion and a continuous audience for her inner life. She processed everything out loud, every feeling, every small frustration, every moment that required a response. She needed the person beside her to receive all of it and reflect it back at the right temperature, the right volume. I am not that person. I never was. The pattern of our marriage had a rhythm I could set my watch to. Where she would build towards something, a conflict, a grievance, a confrontation that needed to happen, and I would try to be the calm center of whatever she'd stirred up. She read my steadiness as distance. She called me cold, called me emotionally unavailable, and I'll grant her this, by the end she wasn't entirely wrong. I had been building walls, but I'd built them because she'd made them necessary, and she resented the very thing she'd caused. We didn't end in one single dramatic moment. We ended the way things arose across hundreds of evenings where I sat across from her and felt like I was delivering lines in a play I hadn't wanted a part in. And then one day I stopped wanting to read them. She needed an audience. I needed a partner. We never figured out how to be both for each other. Lena had been Vivian's closest friend for 12 years by the time the divorce was finalized. They'd known each other since college. If you'd asked me to describe her during those years, I would have said she was the one who didn't take up much room. Always at the edges of gatherings, sitting a little apart, listening more than she spoke, laughing less than everyone else, but meaning it more when she did. She had a way of being present that didn't announce itself. There were 2 moments from those years I never told anyone about. First was at a backyard barbecue at Vivian's parents' house 4 years into the marriage. Everyone had gone outside, and somehow Elena and I ended up the only 2 left at the table, passing plates to the sink in silence. She didn't look at me when she said it, just said quietly, like she was commenting on the weather, "She talks about you like your furniture." That's not right. Then she picked up another stack of dishes and the moment was over. I didn't know what to do with it, so I did nothing, but I kept it. The second was at a Christmas party in our 4th year. Vivian was holding court in the living room, and I drifted to the window to look at the snow coming down under the streetlights. I felt eyes on me and turned. Elena was across the room, watching me with an expression I couldn't name. Not curious, not concerned, Something quieter and more deliberate than either of those. She looked away the instant I turned. I told myself I hadn't really seen what I'd seen, and I left it there. After the divorce, she sent one text. It said, "I'm sorry for how things went. You didn't deserve that." I read it twice and didn't reply. I didn't know what to say to someone who had been standing on the other side of something that had just ended. So I said nothing. I had noticed all of it, every single thing. I just decided I wasn't allowed to. That first night, I made tea, something warm, something for both of us to hold. I set the mug in front of her and she wrapped both hands around it and looked out the kitchen window at the rain still coming down in the dark. She didn't take off her jacket for a long time. I asked what had happened. She told me about a fight with Vivian. Serious, the kind that closes a door. It was about me, she said, about things Vivian still said about me even after all this time. Things that weren't fair and weren't true. She'd finally said so out loud to Vivian's face, and Vivian had made it clear there was no coming back from that. I believed her. Every word of it was true, but I looked at the suitcase in the corner of my hallway, packed full, standing with the patience of something that had been ready for a while. And I understood that the story she just told me was true without being complete. She told me a true story. She just didn't tell me all of it, and I let her keep that for now. The furnace clicked on. The tea steamed. The suitcase stood in the corner, too large and too quiet and too deliberate, saying nothing. I woke up the next morning before 6, the way I always do. I expected to walk downstairs and find the kitchen empty, to make coffee alone, to start my day the way I always started it. Instead, Alina was already at the table. The coffee was made, 2 mugs. She slid one toward me when I sat down. Black, no sugar. I wrapped my hand around the mug and didn't say anything. She didn't either. 10 minutes passed that way, maybe longer. The morning light coming through the window over the sink and spreading across the table, between us and neither of us reaching for words to fill the space. Just 2 people in a kitchen early in the quiet. That belongs to mornings before the day has asked anything of you yet. Except I'd been alone in this kitchen for 3 years. And she knew how I took my coffee. She knew how I took my coffee. I didn't know when she'd learned that, and I didn't ask, because asking would have meant admitting I'd noticed. 3 days passed, then 4, then she told me about her apartment. Her landlord had rented it to someone else while she was tied up in a financial dispute with Vivian over shared expenses. Money that was supposed to come and hadn't arrived. The situation was real. She showed me the email on her phone and I read it through. But I looked at the suitcase again, the way it was packed. I'm thought completely. Everything in its right place, and understood that she hadn't packed like that in response to a landlord's email. You packed like that when you'd already decided where you were going. I didn't know how far in advance. I just knew it had been decided before the emergency. I told her the room wasn't being used. That was also true. It was the first time in a long while that I held an observation instead of speaking it. Not out of fear, just because I needed more time with it before I knew what to do. She worked remotely, graphic design client projects, her laptop open at my dining table while I was at the office. I'd come home in the evenings to find the table tidied, her things neatly to one side, sometimes food already started on the stove. She'd look up when I came in with an expression that wasn't surprised, just receiving, the way you look at something you'd been expecting. She knew when I needed quiet and when I didn't. She never asked which one a given evening called for. She just knew, the way some people know things about you without being told, because they've been paying close enough attention for long enough that the information simply accumulated in them. When I came home emptied by a long day at a job site and had nothing left for conversation, she didn't push for it. When I had something to say, she'd settle back from her work and let it go wherever it wanted to go. No agenda, no performance required. One evening I got home running on nothing, nearly the end of a grinding week. There was food on the stove. She didn't explain it or wait for thanks or make anything out of it. She just set a bowl in front of me and sat down across the table like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world. Like we'd been doing it for years. Another night I was trying to fix a loose bracket on the bookshelf in the hallway. The kind of small repair that's twice as frustrating without a second pair of hands. Alina appeared with a flashlight and held it at exactly the right angle without being asked, without me pointing out where to aim it. I said, "Have you done this before?" She said, "Watched someone do it a long time ago, nothing more." She just kept the light steady until the job was finished. One rainy afternoon, I was working through site drawings at the table. She got up from side without a word and came back with 2 fresh mugs of coffee. She set mine beside my right hand, not interrupting, not making anything of it, not even slowing down, and went back to her own work like nothing had happened. It wasn't romantic. It was something quieter than that, something I hadn't felt in a very long time, the sense that someone was paying attention to me. Not to a version of me they needed, not to whoever they wanted me to be, just me as I actually was on an ordinary afternoon in November, doing nothing remarkable at all. There was a morning around the 6th day. I was in the kitchen tying my shoes before work. Alina was standing in the doorway with her coffee, watching me the way people watch things they've been thinking about for a while. I looked up. "What, nothing," she said. "You look tired." "I'm fine. I know you always say that." I stood up, grabbed my keys before I left. "There's eggs if you haven't eaten," she said. "I know where the eggs are." I walked out, pulled the door shut, and stood on the porch for 10 full seconds before I went down to the car. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. Maybe for the feeling to stop expanding, maybe for myself to catch up to something I'd been refusing to name. She knew where the eggs were. She knew how I took my coffee. She knew when I was tired before I knew it myself. And I kept calling it coincidence, because the alternative meant I had to decide something I wasn't ready for yet. I've spent some time since then thinking about what it means to keep a thing without knowing you're keeping it. Not a secret, something quieter than that, more like the way certain songs stay with you, not because you chose to remember them, but because the melody was particular enough that your memory held on without being asked. Every small moment with Alina had been like that. I hadn't been filing them deliberately, I'd just been living, and they'd adhered to something in me the way particular things do when they land exactly right. I sat with that for a few days without touching it, let it exist alongside everything else, the work, the evenings, the meals, the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings. And each morning she was there before I came down. And each morning the coffee was ready, and each morning I sat down without asking about any of it. We both let the silence do the things. Silence couldn't. There was an evening about a weekend when we sat on the porch after dinner. October cooling down but not cold yet. The trees still holding most of their leaves in the dark. We weren't talking about anything. And then she said, "Do you ever get lonely living here alone?" I actually thought about it before I answered. "Less than I used to," I said. A pause that lasted long enough to be intentional. Then she said, "Me too. Less than I used to." Neither of us explained what we meant. The words sat between us in the dark and we left them there. On the 9th day, Vivian called me. I let it ring twice before I answered. Her voice when it came through was controlled, not angry, which was actually the more worrying version of Vivian. Vivian angry was at least predictable. Vivian controlled was something she'd worked to get to. She said she just wanted to check on Alina, that Alina tended to make impulsive decisions when she was emotional. I said she seems fine, a small pause just long enough to be placed there deliberately, then I'm sure she does. She's very good at seeming fine around you. I told her I'd pass along that she'd called. I hung up and sat with that last sentence for 2 days. I didn't mention the call to Alina. I just held it the way you hold something that might be true before you figured out what to do with it being true. 2 days after that, the doorbell rang. Alina reached the door before I could. I heard it open, and then I heard the silence that settles between two people who've known each other for a long time, and suddenly find themselves standing on opposite sides of something they haven't named yet. I came out to the hallway. Vivian was on the porch, well-dressed, composed on the surface, her eyes moving across everything methodically, the entryway. Alina, the way eyes do when they're building a picture they came prepared to interpret. "I came to talk," she said, like adults, Alina said. "Then talk." Vivian didn't come inside. She stood at the threshold with one hand resting on the doorframe and directed her words at Elena, but her eyes kept coming back to me in intervals, checking. 9 days, Elena. How long are you planning to stay? That's between me and him. Vivian smiled, small, controlled, the kind that means the opposite of warmth. Is it, or is this exactly what you always wanted? Finally, having a reason to be here. Silence. Alina didn't answer. And in not answering, she answered. Vivian shifted her attention toward me. Her voice went softer when she did, which was the version I'd learned long ago to pay the most careful attention to. Did she ever tell you? She used to ask about you after the divorce, multiple times over multiple months. Did she ever tell you that she was the one who kept suggesting I reach out to you, not because she cared about how I was doing, but because she wanted to hear your name out loud in conversation? I didn't move. I didn't confirm anything or deny it. I just stood still and listened. He's had feelings for you for years. Vivian said. I knew. I told myself it was harmless because I didn't want to deal with what it meant. Turns out I was wrong about that. Alina said, "Vivian, stop." Vivian looked at her with something that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't quite contempt. "You packed a full suitcase for one night after 12 years of friendship. You think I don't know how you pack?" The room went very quiet. I looked at Alina for the first time since she'd arrived at my door 9 nights ago. She wouldn't look at me. I knew then Vivian was using the truth as a weapon, handling it with the specific cruelty of someone who knows exactly how sharp a thing is when she picks it up. But the fact that she was weaponizing it didn't make it less true. I'd been handed the answer I hadn't known I was looking for. Delivered by the worst possible person, in the worst possible way, and somehow it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like something that had been slightly out of alignment for a long time finally clicking into place. There's something strange about learning something like that from the wrong source. You'd expect to feel contaminated by the delivery, like the information itself carries the temperature of the person who gave it to you, but it didn't work that way. What Vivian had said landed in me, clean and clear, separate from her and her reasons and everything she'd meant to do with it, because none of what she'd said changed what I'd already been holding. The 2 mugs set out before I was awake. The flashlight at the right angle, the silence she'd learned to read, those hadn't changed, they just had a name now. I stood there for a moment and let myself know what I knew, then I said, "I think you should go, Vivian." Even no edge to it. She looked at me, then at Alina, then back at me one more time. "You two deserve each other." She turned and walked back to her car without rushing. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Lena was still standing with her back partially toward me, looking out the window at the driveway where Vivian's taillights had disappeared. She didn't move for a long time. I didn't go to her. I didn't say anything. I just stayed where I was and let the room settle into itself, the way rooms do after something important has passed through them. After a long silence, Alina said, "I'm sorry." I said, "For what?" She didn't answer. She walked to her room and closed the door behind her, gently without force, like someone who didn't want to disturb anything more than had already been disturbed. She said sorry without saying for what. I didn't ask because I already knew, and I needed one night to sit with knowing before I decided what to do with it. I went to the armchair in the living room and sat down without turning anything on. No television, no music, no book to put between me and my own thinking. I just sat in the quiet and let everything settle into its real shape. The coffee the flash held at the right angle, the eggs, the porch conversation in October dark, the way she'd said less than I used to, with a particular weight to it that I'd been carrying without examining. What surprised me, sitting there in the quiet with Vivian gone, and Alina's door closed, and the house, holding everything that had just happened inside it, was that I didn't feel anger. I'd expected anger at Vivian for delivering the information the way she had, or at Alina for the shape of the thing she'd constructed to arrive at my door. But what I felt instead was something much closer to recognition, like a piece of furniture you've walked around for years was finally moved, and you could see the wall clearly for the first time. All of it arranged into the thing it had always been, pointing toward the suitcase, always the suitcase. She was already at the kitchen window. When I came down the next morning, standing there with both hands wrapped around her mug, looking out at the backyard at the oak trees stripped almost bare, now the last leaves hanging on in 1s and 2s. The coffee wasn't made for 2 this time, just 1 cup hers in the machine left on for me. I measured out the grounds and let it brew and then poured 2 mugs. I set hers beside her on the windowsill and stood next to her and looked out at the same yard she was looking at. Neither of us spoke. Morning light came in low and pale through the glass. I waited. She knew I was waiting. She said, "I owe you the truth." "You don't owe me anything." I said, "I do, because I used a real reason to hide a real reason." She spoke the way you speak when you've rehearsed something, not to sound prepared, but because you wanted to get it right when the moment came. Even careful without performing any of it. The feelings had started in year 3 of my marriage to Vivian. She hadn't acted on them. Said nothing to anyone, not to me, not to Vivian, not to any of the friends they shared. She kept them the way you keep something that has nowhere to go. Privately, quietly, as something that would have to live inside her and not be permitted to grow into anything more. He described it plainly, without drama, without asking for anything from me in the way she said it. When Vivian and I divorced, she thought they would pass. She waited. They didn't pass when Vivian started talking about me the way she did after the split, dismissively, with the casual certainty of someone who'd already moved the story to a version that made her more comfortable in it. Lena had stayed silent too many times. That last night she couldn't. She said what she actually thought, and Vivian ended 12 years in the same sentence, and then I packed a bag. Lena said, and I came here, not because I had nowhere to go, I had places, I just didn't want any of them. She stopped for a moment. I'm sorry that wasn't fair to you. I was quiet for a few seconds. Then I said, the suitcase? What? It was too big for one night. She looked at me, the first full look of the morning. You noticed. First thing I said, neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, I need to tell you something too. I told her that I'd chosen not to see things, not because I was blind to them, but because I hadn't thought I was allowed to look. She was Vivian's person, that line was clear, and I respected it, the way you respect something you know matters. And I stayed on my side of it always, even in the moments when the line felt like it cost something to stand behind. But the things I'd kept without realizing I was keeping them. The 2 mugs set out before I was awake. The flashlight aimed at the right angle without a word. The way she always seemed to know which version of me was coming through the door before I knew it myself. I hadn't discarded any of that. I'd been holding it somewhere in whatever part of a person stores things they haven't decided what to do with yet. When now I understood why it had stayed. I don't know what this is, I said, but I know it's not nothing. And I've lived long enough to know the difference between those 2 things with some confidence. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't reach to fill any of the pauses while I was talking. She just let me finish in my own time. When I was done, she said, so what do we do? I think you find your own place first, I said. And then if you want, we start from the beginning. The right way, she repeated it. The right way, not because of what happened. Not because of Vivian, just us, if there's an us to start from. She looked down at her mug, then looked up at me. Okay, one word, quiet and certain. That was all it needed to be. Outside the window, the sky was pale gray and still. The rain had stopped sometime in the night. Both mugs of coffee were cooling slowly on the windowsill. The suitcase was still in the corner of the hallway, and somewhere between the question and the answer, something had been given permission to exist that hadn't had permission before. 4 months later, we were still going slowly. That was the whole point. Going slowly, not rushing past any of it, doing it right the way I'd said I wanted to do it. Lena found a studio apartment about 2 miles from my house. Top floor, good light, a long windowsill she filled with plants by the end of her first week. I helped her move in on a Saturday, carried boxes up 2 flights of stairs, put furniture where she directed. Didn't try to make more of it than it was. The last thing I brought up from the car was the suitcase. I held it by the handle and looked at her. You're really bringing this thing back, she said. It did its job. We both laughed. The first time either of us had laughed about it. Something loosened in the air when we did, like a knot that had been there so long. It had become part of the texture of things, finally worked free. After that, we settled into a rhythm: coffee on Tuesday mornings near her studio. Dinner on Friday evenings, mine sometimes, hers sometimes. No label on any of it, no conversation about what to call it. Just Tuesday and Friday, reliable as a standing appointment with something you were glad to have. We didn't call it dating. We called it Tuesday, we called it Friday. That was enough. I learned things over those months I hadn't known before. Specific things, the kind you only learn when you're actually paying attention to someone day after day. She hated horror movies but never said so directly. There was always a different excuse: too tired, not feeling it tonight, something else she'd rather watched. I figured it out by the 3rd time and stopped suggesting them. I never told her I'd figured it out. That felt like something I wanted to keep. She learned things too. Apparently, I cook better when there's someone else in the kitchen, not helping, not even involved, just present and talking about something else entirely while I move around the stove. She started arriving before dinner time. Neither of us made a comment about it. There's something I've thought about since about the particular slowness of those 4 months. I'd expected slow to feel like restraint, like holding back, like patience exercised at a cost. It didn't feel that way. It felt more like something being built correctly from the foundation up. Every Tuesday, every Friday was another course of the thing we were making. And none of it was wasted, and none of it was rushed, and none of it felt like waiting for something else to begin. It already was what it was becoming. That was its own kind of satisfaction. One evening, she came over with a sketchbook, working on a new project. She said, wanted the light. I was reading across the room. She settled at the kitchen table and worked quietly, and I let my attention stay with my book. At some point, she got up to get a glass of water, and I glanced over at what she'd been drawing. It was my kitchen, the table, the light from the window over the sink, 2 mugs of coffee sitting side by side on the surface. When did you draw this? I asked. A while ago. While you were staying here, yes, why didn't you show me? She sat back down across the table, because I didn't know how to explain why I drew it. I set the sketchbook down and returned to my book. I didn't need her to explain. I understood what it meant to draw something, because it was a place you were afraid to stop being able to see clearly. One Friday she came over and sat at the table talking while I cooked a client she was frustrated with. Street she'd driven down in the afternoon that still had its Christmas lights up in February. Nothing that needed to go anywhere in particular. After dinner, we sat on the porch because the evening had gone unseasonably warm, the kind of borrowed night that doesn't belong to its month, she said. We used to rehearse what I'd say to you. If I ever actually got the chance, what did you come up with? Nothing that sounded right, so I packed a suitcase instead. I laughed, a real one from somewhere in my chest. Not a polite one. Best decision you ever made, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Yeah, she said. I think so too. I reached over and took her hand. Not a proclamation, not a moment that announced itself. Just her hand in mine, and the crickets starting somewhere in the dark yard, and neither of us needing to add anything to what was already there. Later she was at the door getting ready to leave. She paused and turned back. Same time next week. Same time next week. I watched her headlights pull out of the driveway and disappear. Then I came inside and closed the door behind me. The house was quiet, in the way it had always been, but different now in a way I couldn't have explained and didn't need to explain. The lamp was on, the smell of dinner still in the air. I walked past the hallway and looked at the corner where the suitcase had stood for almost 2 weeks back in October, empty now, just a corner. The suitcase was gone, but what it carried that stayed, and I think it always will. People ask me sometimes, wasn't it strange your ex-wife's best friend? Doesn't that feel complicated? And I tell them everything worth having looks complicated from the outside. I don't carry anger about Vivian. I understand her better from this distance than I ever could from inside the marriage. She saw something I chose not to look at. When the time came, she used it as a weapon, but even a knife held right can open a lock. And the thing she meant to hurt me with turned out to be the very thing that let the air in. As for Alina, she didn't rescue me, and I didn't rescue her. She just showed up at my door with a suitcase full of something she'd been carrying for years, and I let her in. That's all. Sometimes that's everything. What I know now, looking back at who I was before that Thursday in October, is that I had gotten very careful. Careful not to hurt anyone, careful not to be misread, careful not to reach for anything that might pull me back toward a version of life I'd spent 3 years quietly walking away from. That carefulness had started to harden into something that looked like peace from a distance, but was really just a life that had gotten smaller and smaller until it barely made a sound. The night I opened that door, I wasn't careful. I just did the obvious thing, the only thing that made sense when I saw who was standing there in the rain. The night she knocked, I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first time in years that letting someone in didn't feel like a risk. It felt like the most obvious thing in the world. Before you go, I want to ask you 2 things. First, have you ever known something for a long time but waited for the right moment to act on it? Did the moment come on its own, or did you have to make it yourself? And second, do you think it matters how someone arrives in your life, or only what happens after they do? Leave your answer in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. New stories every week from people who've learned that quiet courage is still courage.